This is how humans mate? Zira's multifaceted eyes widened in shock as Brian Robinson, Earth's first astronaut on Brenia, explained the intricacies of human sexual behavior. The Breen researchers' reaction was a stark reminder of just how different their species were. Brian had arrived on Brenia mere days ago as part of a diplomatic mission following first contact between Earth and the technologically advanced but physically frail Breen. The alien world, with its towering crystalline structures and swirling atmospheric patterns, was a far cry from the familiar blue and green of his home planet. Upon landing, Brian was greeted by Korvac, a male Breen scientist assigned as his liaison. As they toured the capital city, Brian couldn't help but notice the aliens' unusual reproduction methods. The Breen appeared to reproduce asexually through a process of cellular division, a fact that Korvac confirmed during their discussions. The Breen's fascination with human biology, particularly sexual reproduction, quickly became apparent. To Brian's surprise, the Breen government requested his participation in a scientific study of human mating habits. The stakes were high. The knowledge gained could lead to a crucial trade agreement between Earth and Brenia. Despite his initial hesitation, Brian agreed to participate. The Breen prepared a specially designed laboratory for the study, complete with monitoring equipment and a simulated Earth-like environment. It was here that Brian met Zira, the female Breen researcher assigned to assist with the study. As the experiments began, Zira's curiosity about human mating rituals grew exponentially. She bombarded Brian with detailed questions about courtship, physical intimacy, and emotional connections. Her fascination quickly turned to shock as Brian delved into the complexities of human sexual behavior. The situation grew tense as other human diplomats objected to what they perceived as an invasive and potentially humiliating study. Brian found himself caught between his duty to foster positive relations with the Breen and his growing discomfort with the intimate nature of the experiments. As days passed, Brian made a startling discovery. The Breen's interest in human reproduction went far beyond mere scientific curiosity. They were facing a population crisis due to genetic degradation caused by millennia of asexual reproduction. The Breen hoped that understanding human sexual reproduction might offer a solution to their species' impending extinction. This revelation raised the stakes for Brian's mission to unprecedented levels. The future of both human-Breen relations and the Breen species itself now hinged on the success of the mating study. Brian realized that his explanations of human sexuality weren't just satisfying alien curiosity. They could be the key to saving an entire civilization. As Zira's shock subsided and her questions became more probing, Brian steeled himself for the challenges ahead. He knew that bridging the vast gulf of understanding between human and Breen reproduction would be no easy task. But with the fate of two worlds hanging in the balance, failure was not an option. Brian took a deep breath, his mind racing with the implications of his recent discovery. The Breen's interest in human reproduction wasn't just scientific curiosity. It was a desperate attempt to save their species from extinction. He glanced at Zira, her multifaceted eyes still wide with shock from his earlier explanations. "Zira," he said, his voice steady despite the gravity of the situation, "I think we need to take this study to the next level." The Breen researcher tilted her head, a gesture Brian had come to recognize as curiosity. "What do you propose, Brian Robinson?" "Instead of just observing and discussing human mating habits, perhaps the Breen should attempt to replicate the process yourselves," he suggested, his heart pounding with the audacity of his idea. Zira's crystalline form seemed to shimmer with excitement. "That is a fascinating proposal. I will consult with our lead geneticist immediately." Within hours, Brian found himself in a high-tech laboratory, face-to-face with Dr. Alara, the Breen's foremost expert in genetics. The alien scientist's form was more angular than Zira's, giving her an air of sharp intellect. "Your proposal is intriguing, Brian Robinson," Dr. Alara said, her voice a melodic hum. "We believe creating a hybrid human Breen embryo using your genetic material and a modified Breen cell could yield valuable insights." Brian nodded, trying to ignore the surreal nature of the situation. "I'm willing to do whatever it takes to help. Where do we start?" The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Brian spent countless hours in the lab, explaining the intricacies of human reproduction to Zira and Dr. Alara. He watched in amazement as they adapted their advanced technology to support the potential growth of a hybrid embryo. As they worked, Brian couldn't help but notice the grace with which Zira moved, the intelligence shining in her multifaceted eyes. Despite their physiological differences, he found himself drawn to her curiosity and dedication. One evening, as they took a break from their work, Zira asked, "Brian, do humans form emotional attachments during their mating process?" Brian felt a flush creep up his neck. "Yes, we often do. It's called falling in love." Zira's form seemed to glow softly. "Fascinating. I believe I'm beginning to understand the appeal of such connections." Before Brian could respond, an alarm blared through the lab. Dr. Alara's voice crackled over the intercom. "We've done it. The hybrid embryo is viable." They rushed to the incubation chamber, where a tiny cluster of cells pulsed with life. It was a moment of triumph, but Brian's elation was short-lived. The embryo's energy readings fluctuated wildly, its very existence hanging by a thread. "It's highly unstable," Dr. Alara explained, her usual calm demeanor tinged with urgency. "We'll need to monitor it constantly and make continuous adjustments to keep it alive." As news of their breakthrough spread, Brian's communicator lit up with urgent messages from Earth. The human diplomats were in an uproar, demanding an immediate end to the study. Public opinion had turned against the mission, with protesters calling it unethical and dangerous. Brian's heart sank as he read a final ultimatum from Earth's government: end the study or face a complete severance of diplomatic ties with Brenia. Torn between his duty to Earth and his commitment to the Breen, Brian struggled to find a way forward. He looked at the fragile embryo, then at Zira, whose eyes reflected a mix of hope and fear. "We can't give up now," he said firmly. "This could be the key to saving your species and forging a lasting alliance between our worlds." Zira placed a delicate crystalline hand on his arm. "But at what cost to you, Brian? Your world seems to be turning against this project." Before he could respond, a commotion outside the lab caught their attention. A group of Breen had gathered, their forms shimmering with agitation. Some voiced support for the experiment, while others protested vehemently against it. "The conservatives fear this change will destroy our way of life," Dr. Ilara explained, her voice heavy with concern. As the days passed, Brian, Zira, and Dr. Ilara worked tirelessly to keep the embryo alive. They took turns monitoring its vital signs, making minute adjustments to its environment. Brian found himself marveling at the dedication of his Breen colleagues and the depth of his own investment in the project's success. During one of their rare breaks, Zira approached Brian, her form glowing softly in the dim light of the lab. "Brian, I've been studying human emotional connections. Is it possible? Could a Breen and a human form such a bond?" Brian's breath caught in his throat. He looked into Zira's multifaceted eyes, seeing the universe reflected in their depths. Before he could respond, an alarm blared from the incubation chamber. They rushed to the embryo's side, watching as its life signs fluctuated dangerously. Dr. Alara's hands moved swiftly over the controls, trying to stabilize the tiny life form. "We're losing it," she said, her voice tight with tension. Brian placed his hand on the incubation chamber, feeling the warmth of the fragile life within. In that moment, he realized that the fate of two worlds, and perhaps his own heart, hung in the balance. The challenge ahead was immense, but as he looked at Zira and the embryo they had created together, he knew that the journey had only just begun. The alarm's blare faded, replaced by the steady hum of the incubation chamber. Brian's hand remained pressed against its warm surface, his eyes fixed on the tiny cluster of cells within. The embryo's life signs stabilized, its resilience a testament to the groundbreaking nature of their work. Dr. Alara's crystalline form shimmered with relief. "We've managed to stabilize it for now, but we need a more permanent solution." Brian turned to face his colleagues, his mind racing with possibilities. "What if we create an artificial womb, something that can provide a more stable environment for the embryo's unique needs?" Dr. Alara's multifaceted eyes gleamed with interest. "An intriguing proposal. I believe we have the technology to attempt such a feat." Over the next several days, the lab buzzed with activity as Dr. Alara designed and constructed a prototype artificial womb. The device was a marvel of Breen technology, a translucent sphere filled with a nutrient-rich fluid that pulsed with soft blue light. As they prepared to transfer the embryo, Brian realized the gravity of the situation. The artificial womb will require constant monitoring and adjustment. I'll oversee its operation. Zira's form seemed to glow with admiration. You've already done so much, Brian. Are you certain? He nodded, his willpower firm. I'm the only human here with intimate knowledge of the project. It has to be me. The transfer was a success, and Brian settled into a grueling routine of monitoring and adjusting the artificial womb's parameters. He worked tirelessly, catching brief moments of sleep when he could. One evening, as Brian made minute adjustments to the womb's nutrient flow, Zira approached him. Brian, there's a situation you need to be aware of. He looked up, noting the tension in her crystalline form. What's wrong? Earth has sent a delegation to investigate our project. They've just entered Brinia's atmosphere. Brian's heart sank. He had known this moment would come, but he hadn't expected it so soon. Who's leading the delegation? An Admiral Hawkins. From what we've gathered, he's quite skeptical of our intentions. Before Brian could respond, the lab doors slid open, revealing a tall, stern-faced man in a crisp military uniform. Admiral Hawkins strode in, his piercing gaze taking in the lab before settling on Brian. Mr. Robinson, the Admiral's voice was cold. I need to see this hybrid embryo immediately. Brian straightened, meeting the Admiral's gaze. Of course, sir. Right this way. As they approached the artificial womb, Admiral Hawkins's eyes widened slightly, the only indication of his surprise. Explain to me, Mr. Robinson, how this experiment is anything but a gross violation of ethical standards? Brian took a deep breath, preparing to defend their work. Admiral, this embryo represents more than just an experiment. It's a potential solution to the Breen's genetic degradation and a bridge between our species. The Admiral's eyes narrowed. And who gave you the authority to make such a decision on behalf of humanity? As Brian struggled to find a response, he felt a gentle touch on his arm. Zira had moved to stand beside him, her presence a silent show of support. The Admiral's gaze shifted to Zira, his expression hardening. I see. This has become more than just a scientific endeavor for you, hasn't it, Mr. Robinson? Before Brian could respond, Dr. Alara intervened. Admiral, perhaps we could discuss the scientific merits of our work in more detail. I assure you, our intentions are purely— Your intentions are not my concern, Admiral Hawkins cut her off. I'm here to evaluate the potential risk to Earth and its citizens. As the tension in the room mounted, Brian noticed a change in the artificial womb's readouts. The embryo's vital signs were fluctuating. Excuse me, he said, brushing past the Admiral to reach the control panel. His fingers flew over the interface, making rapid adjustments. Admiral Hawkins watched with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. What's happening? The embryo is reaching a critical stage in its development, Brian explained, his focus on the readouts. It needs a specific nutrient that we haven't been able to synthesize. Dr. Alara's crystalline form pulsed with concern. What nutrient? Brian hesitated, knowing his next words would complicate matters further. It's a compound found in human breast milk. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Admiral Hawkins's face reddened with anger. This has gone far enough. I'm shutting this experiment down and taking you back to Earth, Robinson. Wait! Brian's mind raced, searching for a solution. There's someone who can help us. Dr. Sarah Bryant, a xenobiologist on Earth. She can provide the nutrient we need. The Admiral's eyes narrowed. Dr. Bryant, your ex-girlfriend? Brian nodded, pushing aside the personal complications. She's the best in her field. If anyone can help us, it's her. After a tense moment, Admiral Hawkins nodded curtly. Make the call. But understand this, Robinson. My report to Earth will not be favorable. As the Admiral strode out of the lab, Brian slumped against the artificial womb, the weight of the situation bearing down on him. Zira moved closer, her crystalline hand resting lightly on his shoulder. Are you all right, Brian? Her voice was soft, filled with concern. He looked up at her, seeing his own worries reflected in her multifaceted eyes. I don't know, Zira. But we've come too far to give up now. As Brian turned to make the call that would bring Sarah to Brenia, he couldn't shake the feeling that their challenges were only beginning. The fate of the embryo, the future of human-brain relations, and his own heart hung in a delicate balance. With Sarah's imminent arrival and Admiral Hawkins's looming presence, Brian steeled himself for the complex days ahead. Brian's fingers trembled as he dialed Sarah's number. The lab fell silent, save for the gentle hum of the artificial womb. As he waited for her to answer, his gaze drifted to Zira, her crystalline form shimmering with concern. "Sarah, it's Brian. I need your help." The next few days passed in a blur of activity. Sarah arrived on Brenia with a case of carefully preserved human breast milk compounds, her expertise proving invaluable as they worked to stabilize the embryo. Despite the tension of their past relationship, Brian found himself grateful for her presence. However, their progress was soon overshadowed by a series of alarming complications. The artificial womb began to malfunction, its readouts flashing urgent warnings. "The embryo's vital signs are fluctuating dangerously," Dr. Alara announced, her multifaceted eyes scanning the data streams. "We need to take immediate action." Sarah leaned in, studying the readouts. "The artificial environment is failing. We need to transfer the embryo to a biological host." A heavy silence fell over the lab. Brian's mind raced, considering the implications. But who? The embryo is part human, part breen. Who could possibly carry it? Zira stepped forward, her form pulsing with commitment. "I will do it." Brian's heart clenched. "Zira, no. We don't know what risk this could pose to you." "It's our best chance," Dr. Alara interjected. "Zira's physiology is more adaptable than a human's. With some modifications, she might be able to support the hybrid embryo." The next hours were a whirlwind of preparations. Dr. Alara and Sarah worked tirelessly to modify Zira's reproductive system, combining human and breen medical techniques in ways never before attempted. As they prepared for the delicate transfer procedure, alarms blared throughout the facility. A young breen scientist burst into the lab, his form flickering with agitation. "Earth forces are breaching the facility. Admiral Hawkins has ordered the termination of the experiment." Brian's blood ran cold. He turned to Sarah, who nodded in silent understanding. They had to create a diversion. "Dr. Alara, get Zira to safety. We'll hold them off," Brian commanded. As Earth forces stormed the facility, Brian and Sarah worked frantically to erase data and destroy key equipment. The sound of boots echoed down the corridor, growing closer with each passing second. "Go," Brian shouted to Dr. Alara and Zira. "We'll meet you at the rendezvous point." As the two breens slipped out through a hidden passage, Brian and Sarah prepared to face the incoming soldiers. The lab doors burst open, revealing a squad of heavily armed Earth military personnel. "Stand down and step away from the equipment," the squad leader ordered. Brian raised his hand slowly, his mind racing for a way out. Suddenly, Sarah knocked over a shelf of volatile chemicals, filling the air with thick, acrid smoke. In the ensuing chaos, they managed to slip past the disoriented soldiers and into the winding corridors of the breen facility. The chase through the breen capital was like nothing Brian had ever experienced. The city's architecture, designed for the breen's unique physiology, made navigation a challenge. Brian found himself struggling to keep up with Sarah as they leapt across impossible gaps and scaled smooth crystal surfaces. As they ran, Brian could see panic spreading through the breen population. News of the Earth military's actions had spread quickly, and the once welcoming faces of the breen now looked at them with fear and anger. They finally reached the rendezvous point, a hidden chamber deep within the heart of the breen capital. Dr. Alara was there, monitoring Zira's vital signs as she lay on a makeshift medical bed. "The transfer was successful," Dr. Alara reported. "Zira's body is adapting to support the embryo, but we need to keep her hidden and safe." Brian moved to Zira's side, taking her delicate crystalline hand in his. "How do you feel?" Zira's form shimmered weakly. "Strange, but hopeful. I can feel the child growing within me, Brian. It's extraordinary." Their moment of peace was short-lived. The chamber's communication system crackled to life, broadcasting an emergency message from the Breen government. They had issued an ultimatum to Earth: withdraw all military personnel or face severe diplomatic consequences. As Brian listened to the message, he felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. He had started this experiment to bridge the gap between humans and Breen, but now it threatened to tear them apart. "We need to find a way to end this peacefully," Sarah said, voicing Brian's thoughts. "This child could be the key to bringing our species together, not driving them apart." As if in response to Sarah's words, Zira gasped softly. Her form began to pulse with a soft, warm light. "Brian," she whispered, her voice filled with wonder. "I can feel it moving." In that moment, watching Zira's body adapt to nurture their hybrid child, Brian knew that he would do whatever it took to protect them and the future they represented. The sound of distant explosions echoed through the chamber, a stark reminder of the challenges that lay ahead. But as Brian looked at Zira, then at Sarah and Dr. Alara, he saw in their eyes the same commitment that burned within him. The fight for the future of both species had only just begun. As the distant explosions grew louder, Brian knew they had to act fast. "We need to move," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Sarah, help me with Zira." As they prepared to leave, Dr. Alara's multifaceted eyes flickered with an idea. "Wait, I have a plan." Using her intimate knowledge of Breen technology, Dr. Alara quickly programmed a series of holographic decoys. The air shimmered as lifelike projections of Brian, Sarah, and Zira materialized around them. "These should buy us some time," Dr. Alara explained, her crystalline form pulsing with concentration. They moved swiftly, supporting Zira as they navigated through a hidden panel in the chamber floor. The network of tunnels beneath the Breen capital was a maze of crystal and stone, illuminated by bioluminescent fungi that cast an eerie blue glow. As they descended deeper into the tunnels, Zira suddenly gasped, her form contorting in pain. "Brian," she whispered, her voice strained. "Something's wrong." They halted and Dr. Alara swiftly unpacked a portable medical scanner from her pack. The device hummed as she passed it over Zira's midsection. "The embryo," Dr. Alara's voice was tight with concern. "It's growing at an accelerated rate. Zira's body is struggling to adapt." Sarah leaned in, studying the readouts. "We need a proper medical facility. This pregnancy is unlike anything we've seen before." Brian's mind raced. They couldn't return to the Breen facility, and Earth was out of the question. Then an idea struck him. "I know someone who might help," Brian said, pulling out a communication device. He punched in a series of codes, praying his old friend would answer. "Marcus, it's Brian. I need your help." Captain Marcus Bryant's voice crackled through the device. "Brian, what's going on?" Brian quickly explained their situation. There was a long pause before Marcus responded. "You're asking me to risk my career, my ship, everything," Marcus said, his voice heavy. "I know," Brian replied, "but this is bigger than all of us. Please, Marcus." Another pause. "All right, there's a hidden launch pad in Sector 7. I'll have my ship, the Harmony, in position to pick you up, but you'll have to hurry." As Brian ended the call, the sound of boots echoed through the tunnels. Admiral Hawkins's forces were closing in. "We need to split up," Brian said, his heart racing. "Sarah and I will create a diversion. Dr. Alara, get Zira to the launch pad." Before they parted, Brian turned to Zira. He pressed his hand against her crystalline form, feeling the warmth of the life growing within her. "Stay safe," he whispered. Brian and Sarah raced through the tunnels, deliberately making noise to draw attention away from Zira and Dr. Alara. They emerged in a busy Breen marketplace, causing a commotion as they weaved through the startled crystalline beings. Earth soldiers burst into the marketplace, their weapons raised. "There they are!" one shouted. Brian and Sarah ducked and weaved, using the Breen architecture to their advantage. They leapt across impossible gaps and scaled smooth crystal surfaces, their hearts pounding as they led the soldiers on a wild chase through the alien city. Meanwhile, Dr. Alara guided Zira through the quieter depths of the tunnel system. They emerged at the hidden launch pad, where a small group of Breen scientists awaited them. "Quickly," Dr. Alara urged, helping Zira into the shuttle. The engines roared to life as they lifted off, the Breen capital shrinking beneath them. Earth military vessels swarmed the skies, but the shuttle's advanced cloaking technology kept them hidden as they ascended. In orbit, the Harmony appeared, its docking bay opening to receive them. As the shuttle touched down, Captain Marcus Bryant was there to greet them, his face a mixture of concern and amazement as he saw Zira. "My God, Brian," he breathed, "what have you gotten yourself into?" Before anyone could respond, Zira cried out in pain. Dr. Alara and Sarah rushed her to the ship's medical bay, their faces grim with concentration as they worked to stabilize her condition. Brian paced outside the medical bay, his mind racing. They had escaped immediate danger, but the challenges ahead seemed insurmountable. The fate of two species rested on the life growing within Zira, a life that was developing in ways they barely understood. As he waited for news, Brian knew that their actions today would reshape the future of human-Breen relations. The journey ahead was uncertain, fraught with scientific, political, and personal challenges. But as he heard Zira's voice from within the medical bay, strong despite her pain, he felt a glimmer of hope. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Brian's willpower was soon put to the test as Zira's condition rapidly evolved. The Harmony's medical bay became a hive of activity. Dr. Alara and Sarah worked tirelessly, their expertise merging in a dance of human ingenuity and Breen precision. The hybrid child's growth accelerated beyond their initial projections, pushing Zira's body to its limits. "Her crystalline structure is adapting," Dr. Alara announced, her multifaceted eyes scanning the readouts. "But the rate of change is unprecedented." Sarah nodded, her brow furrowed in concentration. "We need to stabilize the amniotic environment. The human components are reacting unpredictably with Zira's biochemistry." As they worked, Captain Marcus Bryant entered the medical bay, his face etched with concern. "Brian, we have a situation. Earth and Breenia have both dispatched vessels to intercept us. They're demanding we turn over the hybrid child." Brian's heart raced. He looked at Zira, her form pulsing with the life growing within her, then back to Marcus. "We can't let that happen. This child could be the key to saving both our species." Marcus nodded grimly. "I agree, but we're running out of options. The Harmony wasn't built for this kind of standoff." Suddenly, alarms blared throughout the ship. Sarah rushed to a nearby console, her fingers flying over the controls. "Zira's going into labor." The medical bay erupted into controlled chaos. Dr. Alara's crystalline form shimmered with intensity as she prepared for the unprecedented delivery. Sarah coordinated with the ship's AI, adapting human medical protocols on the fly. Brian took his place at Zira's side, his hand intertwining with her crystalline fingers. "You can do this," he whispered, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. Zira's form undulated, waves of light pulsing through her as contractions racked her body. "Brian," she gasped, her voice strained. "I can feel it. Our child. It's coming." Hours passed in a blur of activity. The Harmony's engines hummed as Marcus maneuvered the ship through a delicate dance, keeping the approaching Earth and Breen vessels at bay while maintaining a stable environment for the birth. Finally, with a burst of light that momentarily blinded everyone in the medical bay, Zira's form split open. Brian watched in awe as Dr. Alara reached in, gently extracting a small, glistening form. "It's a boy," Dr. Alara announced, her voice filled with wonder. As the newborn took his first breath, a cry unlike anything Brian had ever heard filled the medical bay. It was neither human nor Breen, but something beautifully, perfectly in between. Sarah quickly wrapped the child in a specially designed blanket, its material adapting to the unique needs of his hybrid physiology. "His vitals are strong," she reported, relief evident in her voice. "But his growth rate? It's off the charts." Brian cradled the newborn, marveling at his son's appearance. The child's skin was a pale blue, almost translucent in places. His eyes, when they opened, were large and luminous, seeming to shift between human and Breen characteristics. "Zephyr," Zira whispered, her form slowly reforming. "His name is Zephyr." As Brian placed Zephyr in Zira's arms, the gravity of their situation came crashing back. The comm system crackled to life, Marcus's voice tense. "Brian, we're out of time. The Earth and Breen ships are demanding we power down and prepare to be boarded." Dr. Alara's form pulsed with sudden inspiration. "Wait, I need to run one more scan on Zephyr. There's something unique about his genetic structure." As she worked, Brian and Zira exchanged worried glances. Their son, barely an hour old, was already at the center of an interstellar crisis. Dr. Alara's excited voice broke the tension. "It's remarkable. Zephyr's DNA contains a sequence that could potentially reverse the genetic degradation in the Breen population. This child, he could be the salvation of my people." The implications of this discovery hung heavy in the air. Zephyr wasn't just a bridge between two species. He was the key to the Breen's survival. Before they could fully process this information, the ship shuddered. Marcus's voice came through again, urgent and strained. "We've got more problems. A group of extremists has just attacked research facilities on Breenia. They're demanding we hand over Zephyr and all our research data." Brian's mind raced. The stakes had just become impossibly higher. Zephyr wasn't just their son anymore. He was the focal point of a conflict that could reshape the future of two civilizations. As alarms blared and the Harmony's shields strained against the mounting external pressures, Brian looked at Zira and their newborn son. In Zephyr's unique features, he saw not just the blending of two species, but the promise of a future where humanity and the Breen could coexist and thrive. The challenges ahead were immense, but as Brian held his family close, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. They would face whatever came next, not just for themselves, but for the future of both their worlds. Species. The weight of their responsibility settled on Brian's shoulders as he gazed at Zephyr, the living bridge between two worlds. The moment of quiet contemplation shattered as the ship rocked violently. Captain Marcus's voice crackled over the intercom, tension evident in his tone. "We've got multiple breaches. Intruders on board." Brian's military instincts kicked in. He turned to Zira, his eyes conveying a silent message of love and tenacity. "Stay with Zephyr. I'll help secure the ship." As Brian rushed out of the medical bay, Dr. Alara's multifaceted eyes widened with sudden realization. "Wait, we need to analyze Zephyr's DNA further. There might be a way to save my people." Sarah nodded, her fingers flying over the medical bay's controls. "I'm on it. Let's isolate the key genetic markers." The ship shuddered again as Brian joined the security team in the corridor. The infiltrators, now identified as members of the Breen Purity Front, BPF, had breached multiple sections of the Harmony. Their crystalline forms shimmered as they advanced, wielding energy weapons that left scorch marks on the walls. Brian's human combat training gave him an edge. He ducked and rolled, catching the BPF off guard with moves they'd never encountered. His fist connected with the smooth surface of a Breen extremist, the impact sending shockwaves through the crystalline form. "Seal off sections 3 through 7, Brian shouted into his comm unit. "We need to contain them." As the battle raged through the ship's corridors, Zira faced her own dilemma in the medical bay. The sensors blared warnings of approaching intruders. She cradled Zephyr close, her crystalline form pulsing with protective instinct. "We can't stay here," she said to Dr. Alara and Sarah. "We need to move." Using her intimate knowledge of the ship's layout, Zira led them through a series of maintenance tunnels. They created makeshift safe rooms, moving essential research data and equipment as they went. Zephyr remained quiet, his luminous eyes taking in the chaos around him with an eerie calmness. In the ship's environmental control room, Captain Marcus worked feverishly alongside his crew. "We need to reclaim control," he muttered, his brow furrowed in concentration. "What if we use the ventilation system?" A junior officer's eyes lit up. "Sir, we have a non-lethal sedative gas that affects Breen physiology. We could distribute it through the compromised sections." Marcus nodded grimly. "Make it happen, and pray it works." Meanwhile, Dr. Alara made a breakthrough in her analysis of Zephyr's genetic structure. Her crystalline form vibrated with excitement as she turned to Sarah. "Look at this sequence. It could be the key to reversing our genetic degradation." Sarah studied the data, her eyes widening. "You're right, but we need the synthesizer in Lab 4 to create a viable treatment." Dr. Alara's excitement dimmed. Lab 4 is in a section overrun by the BPF. As they grappled with this new challenge, Brian found himself in the thick of the fighting. His uniform was torn and singed, a gash on his forehead painting his face with streaks of red. He moved with purpose, disabling BPF members with precise strikes and improvised tactics. Suddenly, his comm unit crackled to life. "Brian!" It was Zira, her voice tight with fear. "They've found us. We're moving to Safe Room C, but I don't know how long we can stay ahead of them." Brian's heart raced. "I'm on my way. Hold on." As he turned to rush to his family's aid, a towering Breen figure stepped into his path. The crystalline being's form pulsed with malevolent energy. "Korzak," Brian breathed, recognizing the leader of the BPF infiltrators. Korzak's multifaceted eyes gleamed with fanatical intensity. "The abomination you call a child will not leave this ship alive. The purity of the Breen must be preserved." Brian's muscles tensed, ready for combat. "You're wrong, Korzak. Zephyr is the future, for both our species." The two clashed in a furious melee, human strength and drive against Breen agility and advanced physiology. Brian's fist connected with Korzak's crystalline form, sending shockwaves through the alien's body. In return, Korzak's limbs elongated and sharpened, slashing at Brian with razor-like precision. As they fought, the ship's ventilation system hummed to life. A fine mist began to fill the corridors, causing the BPF members to stumble and sway. But Korzak, driven by his zealotry, seemed to resist the sedative's effects. Brian, seeing an opening, executed a complex series of strikes he'd learned in Special Forces training. Korzak, unprepared for the human's unorthodox style, faltered. With a final decisive blow, Brian sent the Breen leader crashing to the ground. Gasping for breath, Brian activated his comm unit. "Zira, what's your status?" "We're in Safe Room C," she replied, her voice strained. "But they're trying to breach the door. Hurry, Brian." As Brian raced through the ship's corridors, Dr. Alara and Sarah worked feverishly to synthesize a treatment from Zephyr's DNA. The sounds of battle drew closer, the fate of two species hanging in the balance as the Harmony hurtled through space, surrounded by wary Earth and Breen military vessels. The next few moments would determine not just the fate of Zephyr and his family, but the future of human-Breen relations and the survival of an entire species. As Brian rounded the final corner, his heart pounding in his ears, he knew that everything hinged on what happened next. Brian's lungs burned as he raced through the corridors, the sounds of battle echoing around him. He rounded the final corner, his heart pounding in his ears, knowing that everything hinged on what happened next. The scene that greeted him was chaos incarnate. BPF members were attempting to breach the door to Safe Room C, their crystalline forms shimmering with malevolent energy. Brian's muscles tensed, ready to leap into action, when a familiar figure stepped into view. Korzak, the leader of the BPF infiltrators, turned to face Brian. His multifaceted eyes gleamed with fanatical intensity. "You're too late, human. The abomination will not leave this ship alive." Brian's eyes hardened. "You're wrong, Korzak. Zephyr is the future, for both our species." Without warning, Korzak lunged forward, his limbs elongating and sharpening into razor-like appendages. Brian ducked and rolled, narrowly avoiding a slash that left deep gouges in the metal wall behind him. The two clashed in a furious melee, human strength and drive against Breen agility and advanced physiology. Brian's fist connected with Korzak's crystalline form, sending shockwaves through the alien's body. In return, Korzak's attacks came with lightning speed, forcing Brian to rely on his special forces training to stay alive. As they fought, a subtle change began to occur in the ship's atmosphere. A fine mist started to fill the corridors, barely noticeable at first. Brian, recognizing the telltale signs of the sedative gas, held his breath. Korzak, however, seemed oblivious to the danger, his zealotry driving him forward. The Breen leader's movements began to slow, his attacks becoming less coordinated. Seizing the opportunity, Brian launched into a complex series of strikes, each blow precisely targeted to disrupt Korzak's crystalline structure. Suddenly, Korzak's form pulsed with energy. A shimmering force field sprang to life around him, creating a bubble that pushed back the sedative gas. Brian found himself trapped in close quarters with his opponent, the air growing thin. Realizing he was running out of time, Brian's mind raced. His gaze darted around the corridor, assessing his options. In that moment, his astronaut training kicked in. The microgravity environment of the ship could be turned to his advantage. With a powerful kick, Brian propelled himself off the wall. He twisted in midair, using the lack of gravity to build momentum. Korzak, still adjusting to the effects of the sedative, couldn't react in time. Brian slammed into the Breen leader with his full weight. The impact sent them both crashing into the opposite wall, the force disrupting Korzak's personal field. In an instant, the sedative gas rushed in. Korzak's form wavered, his multifaceted eyes dimming. "No," he gasped, his voice fading. "The purity must be, preserved." As Korzak lost consciousness, Brian quickly secured him, using restraints designed to hold Breen physiology. Gasping for air, he activated his comm unit. "This is Brian. Section secure. All clear." The response was immediate. Security teams flooded the area, securing the remaining BPF members. Medical staff rushed to tend to the injured. Through it all, Brian's focus remained on one thing: his family. He staggered to Safe Room C, his body aching from the brutal fight. The door slid open, revealing Zira cradling Zephyr, with Dr. Alara and Sarah hovering protectively nearby. "Brian!" Zira's voice was filled with relief. She reached out to him, her crystalline form pulsing with emotion. Before Brian could respond, Dr. Alara's excited voice cut through the moment. "We've done it! We've synthesized the cure!" Sarah nodded, her eyes shining with triumph. "We've already started administering it to Zira. The results are incredible." Brian watched in amazement as Zira's form seemed to stabilize, the subtle signs of genetic degradation fading before his eyes. Zephyr cooed softly, seemingly unfazed by the recent chaos. "We need to spread the word," Brian said, his mind already racing ahead. "This changes everything." As if in response to his words, Captain Marcus's voice came over the ship-wide comm. "Attention all personnel. The threat has been neutralized. Earth and Breen officials are preparing to board for an assessment of the situation." Brian looked at Zira, then at Zephyr. "I think it's time we introduced our son to the galaxy." Together they made their way to the main airlock. The crew of the Harmony, battered but unbowed, lined the corridors. As Brian and Zira passed, holding Zephyr between them, a ripple of hope seemed to pass through the assembled humans and Breen. The airlock cycled open, revealing a delegation of Earth and Breen officials. Their expressions of stern diplomacy faltered as they took in the sight before them. Brian, bandaged but standing proud, with Zira by his side, cradling a cooing Zephyr. The hybrid child, his skin a pale blue and his eyes large and luminous, reached out towards the officials. His tiny hand, neither fully human nor fully Breen, touched the face of the nearest Earth representative. The stern diplomat's expression softened, a smile breaking through years of practiced neutrality. Zephyr then turned, reaching for the Breen official. As his unique fingers made contact with the crystalline surface, a soft glow seemed to emanate from the point of contact. The Breen's form pulsed with an emotion that needed no translation: wonder. In that simple gesture, the tensions of the past hours, the fears and suspicions of years, began to melt away. Zephyr, in his innocence, had bridged a gap that countless diplomats and politicians had failed to cross. Dr. Alara stepped forward, her form shimmering with hardly restrained excitement. "Esteemed representatives," she began, her voice clear and strong, "we have made a breakthrough that will change the course of both our species." As she launched into an explanation of the cure derived from Zephyr's DNA, Brian and Zira exchanged a look. In the midst of this historic moment, surrounded by the promise of a new era of cooperation, they found themselves focused on something much simpler: the miracle of their family. Zephyr, nestled between them, let out a happy gurgle. His eyes, shifting between human and Breen characteristics, seemed to hold the promise of a future neither of them could have imagined. A future where the boundaries between species faded and the galaxy became a little smaller, a little more united. As the officials crowded around, eager to learn more about the cure and the child who made it possible, Brian and Zira knew that their journey was just the beginning. The challenges ahead were immense, but so too were the possibilities. With Zephyr as their guiding star, they prepared to step into a new chapter, not just for themselves, but for all of humanity in the Breen. The path ahead was uncharted, but as they stood together, a family united across the stars, they knew they were ready to face whatever the universe had in store.
You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.